Theodore Ashbridge, Duke of Marwen, signed away the dukedom at 4 on a Thursday afternoon, with the spring rain just beginning to streak the south windows of his study. And he did it before Isabel Harcourt had so much as set foot in his house. He laid the pen down across the inkstand with a care that did not match the violence of the act. The paper before him was small. It bore the seal of his own solicitor, the cramped initials of 2 witnesses, and a single line of his hand stating that he, Theodore James Ashbridge, 9th Duke of Marwen, did this day relinquish all claims, privileges, and styles of the Marwen dukedom in favour of his cousin presumptive, Edmund Carstairs, and would henceforth answer to the courtesy of Mr. Ashbridge. He had chosen, and he had not been asked. Brierly, his man of business, lifted the page by its corner and waited to see whether his lordship, his erstwhile lordship, would speak. A small clock somewhere in the inner room struck the half-hour. "You will keep this in your own hand until I send for it." Theo's voice did not lift. The decision had cost him the lifting. "Not Carstairs, not the family solicitor. You." "Yes, Your Grace." The 2 words landed in the room and lay there a moment, the way a glove lays where it has been dropped on a polished table. "Mr. Ashbridge." Brierly's mouth tightened. He had served the 8th Duke for 30 years and could not yet bear to say the name. Mr. Ashbridge. He added one further instruction. Not a word of it to Lady Marwen. Not yet. Brierly inclined his head 1/4 inch, no more. "Your aunt will be... She will be a great many things. I have written her separately. Please be so good as to leave me." Brierly folded the page, set it inside an inner pocket of his coat that he had not used in a 1/4 century, and bowed before he went. Theo did not watch him go. He sat with his hands flat on the writing desk and listened to the rain take the gravel in the front court. First, a few light drops, then the steady wash of it against stone, and counted, as he had counted since he was 8, the windows on the front of the house. There were 17. There had been 17 for 240 years. The desk under his hand was the great oak desk that had been his grandfather's and his father's, with the ink burn on the corner where his father had set a candle one September night in 1812 and forgotten it. The grain ran east to west under his fingers, a fine, close grain, scuffed where the blotter had rested for 40 years in the same place. He could feel the very small ridge along that edge through his cuff. The pen lay across the inkstand. The inkstand was silver and had been a wedding gift to his mother. The blotter was green. The wax was red, in a stick scored with 3 of his own thumbprints from earlier in the afternoon, when he had pressed it, and pressed it again, and pressed it a 3rd time, before he had had the steadiness to seal. He had not, when he was a boy, ever imagined himself sealing anything important at this desk. He had imagined Henry doing it. Henry had imagined Henry doing it. The 2 of them had once, on a wet Tuesday in 1805, sat on the carpet under this desk, with toy soldiers, and pretended that the panelled space beneath was a barricade outside Vienna, and Henry, who had been 11 then, had said in his certain voice that when he was Duke, he would receive his ambassadors here. Theo had not pointed out that ambassadors did not sit under desks. It had not seemed important. When the Count was done, he rose and crossed to the long sash that gave onto the drive, and looked out toward the gates as if he could see her carriage from a distance of 3 counties. She would not arrive for another hour. He had given her until 5. He had also given her the things she had not asked for. He hoped she would not be too angry to forgive him for it. The carriage that came at 5 was not hers. The carriage that came at 5 was a smart town chaise with a new coat of japanning, 4 blacks, and a coachman who knew the drive too well, and the figure who stepped down was the very last figure in England Theo wished to see before the hour was up. "Edmund," Theo said from the top step. Edmund Carstairs gave him the warm, wide smile that he gave everyone within a peer's reach. He was 28, tall in a slightly stooped way that he had cultivated to suggest sensitivity, and his coat was indigo velvet of an extraordinarily good cut. He had been called handsome by every dowager in 3 counties, and he never let any of them forget it. "My dear cousin," Edmund pressed Theo's hand. "Look at you in your shirt sleeves. I have driven up to find a duke at home, and what do I find? A man at his ledgers like any squire of £40 a year. Marwan, you wound me." "You will be wounded a little more before the evening is over," Theo said. "Come in. The rain is in earnest." He led Edmund through the wainscoted hall, past the standing clock that had been 3 weeks slow since February, into the morning room where the small fire had been kept up and the curtains had not yet been drawn. The room smelt of wood smoke and the green of the season's first-cut hyacinths. Mrs. Pell, the housekeeper, set hyacinths in every fireplace room from March, and the smell was the smell of Marwan in spring, and had been for as long as anyone living could remember. Edmund took the better chair without being offered it. "I am told," he said, "that you mean to do a foolish thing. I am told you mean to marry a girl who is not, how shall I put it kindly, not at all in the part." Theo did not sit. He took the bell pull instead. "Mrs. Pell will bring tea." The bell pull moved under Theo's hand. A small, clear bronze chime sounded somewhere far behind the green baize door, and 3 heartbeats later, the sound of Mrs. Pell's quiet shoes could be made out, crossing the slate flags of the back passage. The hyacinths on the chimney-piece had begun to throw their second wave of scent. Heavy, cold, very faintly sweet. The smell of a March that was thinking about April. The wainscot of the morning room creaked once as the fire warmed it. "Tea." Edmund laughed without humour. "Cousin, the dowager wrote me from Bath. She is in transports of dismay. The whole of Marylebone is already discussing what they will do with you when you next show your face at the Lords. Lady Jersey has, I am told, been heard to call you the most romantical fool of the season. And that, from Lady Jersey, is not a compliment, Marwan. It is an instrument." "It is not Lady Jersey's business," Theo said. "It is also not yours." Edmund had not yet sat back. His glove still rested on the chair arm. "It is mine, if you make the wrong choice." Edmund's smile took the warmth out of itself slowly, leaving only the curve. "I am next in the entail. If you marry her, and the title goes to ruin, the title goes to ruin in my hand. I will be answering for it." "You will be answering for nothing." Edmund had been turning his glove over in his hand, slowly, the way a man turns a card he does not yet want to play. He set the glove down at last on the arm of the chair. The leather of it was the colour of new straw, and the seam at the wrist had been mended once, very neatly, in a thread that was not quite the right shade. Theo saw the mending and looked away from it. He had known, since they were both at Harrow, what the small economies of his cousin's wardrobe cost his cousin's pride. "Speak plainly." "I have spoken plainly already. You have only to read it." Theo did not look at him. He looked instead at the rain on the long window. "But not now. After tea, after she comes. She does not yet know." Edmund went very still. "What does she not yet know?" "What I have done." "And what have you done?" Theo turned from the window. "I have chosen." Edmund stared at him for one long heartbeat, in which a more cautious man would have understood that he had walked into a room he could not get out of by the door he had come in. Then, because Edmund was not a cautious man, he laughed. "My dear Marwan, you have not even seen her in a fortnight. You cannot have chosen anything. You have brooded over it. We all brood. The girl is well enough. Marry her on terms. Settle her 2,000 a year. Set her up in the dower house. Send her to Italy with a companion when the season grows tedious. But for the love of the entail, do not, do not, do not. I have done it." The hyacinths did their small work in the silence. Somewhere in the back of the house, a footman crossed a flagstone passage. A spaniel bayed once in the kennels and stopped. "Done what?" Edmund said, and he was not asking now. Theo did not answer. He went to the writing desk in the corner, the smaller one, not the great desk under the window, and lifted from it a sealed envelope addressed to himself in his own hand. He held it out. "It is not yours yet," Theo said. "Brearley has the original. This is your copy. It bears my hand and seal. It states that I have this day relinquished the Marwen dukedom in favour of you, and that the renunciation is to be delivered to Garter King of Arms tomorrow at noon by Brearley in person. Unless I am, by tomorrow at noon, able to send Brearley a second instruction in my own hand, countermanding it." Edmund did not take the envelope. He looked at it as if it might bite him. "You are not in earnest." The hyacinths in the cut crystal moved very slightly in the small, warm current from the hearth. A thread of pale smoke from one of the candle sconces drifted past Edmund's shoulder and dissolved against the wainscot. Outside the long sash, the rain had begun to ease. The dark trunks of the limes along the south drive showed wet and black against a sky that had turned, in the last quarter hour, the colour of polished slate. "I am." Theo did not raise his voice. He did not move from the window. The bell pull tassel, green silk and pale gold thread, the same one his grandfather had pulled in 1791, hung exactly where it had hung for 30 years, and he kept his fingers, very deliberately, away from it. "And the condition?" "That she accepts me, knowing what I have done, knowing what I have surrendered, knowing that what she would be marrying, if she has me, is a man called Mr. Ashbridge, of nothing in particular. If she will have me on those terms, Brearley sends the countermand and I take it back. If she will not, and I will not press her, Edmund, I will not, the dukedom is yours by midday tomorrow." "You have lost your reason." "On the contrary," Theo said very quietly. "I have, for the first time in 9 years, found it." Edmund's hand closed on the envelope. He turned it over once, twice. He did not put it into his coat. He held it as though it were not paper, but something more dangerous, a small, live thing that might fly out of his palm. Edmund laid his glove flat across the chair arm and looked, for the first time, at the rain. "She will accept you," he said after a moment. "Of course she will accept you. She is not a fool. She will have heard from her father by tonight what the offer is worth, and by morning she will be Duchess of Marwen, and you will look at me across the breakfast table and say it was a near-run thing, and laugh. And I shall, I assure you, laugh with you. I have not come into the entail expecting to come into it. I have come for tea. Mrs. Pell will be along directly. And in the unlikely event, the very unlikely event, that she should refuse you on those terms." "Then," Theo said, "I shall have done what I should have done at 22, when my father first put me to this house. I shall have stopped pretending the title was the thing that mattered. The estate is settled on younger sons. The land is well managed. Marwen will not fall. You will be a passable duke, and I shall be a tolerable steward, and we shall not, between us, beggar the tenantry. I have given a great deal of thought to it. More thought, I assure you, than to anything I have ever done." Edmund looked at the envelope a second time. Then, with a slowness that startled Thea more than the haste would have done, he put it inside his coat. The fire spat once, sharply. "You will regret this by Sunday. It is Thursday. I will be here on Sunday then." Edmund rose. He had not touched his tea. "I shall, for the family's sake, allow this folly its 24 hours. I shall not, however, allow it a week. Cousin." He bowed, with a courtesy that was not courtesy at all. "Until tomorrow's post. Until then." He was gone, into the rain and the chaise, before Mrs. Pell had brought the tea things in. Theo did not watch him go either. He stood in the morning room, with his hand on the bell rope, and listened to the 4 blacks taking the gravel back down to the gates, and counted, again, the 17 windows, and waited for the second carriage of the afternoon. The rain had thickened. It came now in close, grey sheets that bent the budded heads of the laurels in the south border, and rang flat on the lead of the porch roof. The smell of wet stone rose from the front court, That old, cold smell of the Marwen courtyard in March, that Theo had known since he could walk, with the slick of mud underfoot, and the green, sour scent of crushed moss at the joins of the paving. He could smell, too, the wet of his own collar where the rain had touched him in the doorway, and the faint metal of Edmund's cologne, bergamot, vetiver, a brand from Bond Street that Edmund had bought himself for his last birthday, still in the room where Edmund had sat. He crossed to the small mirror over the morning room mantel and looked, briefly, at his own face. He had not slept the night before. The hollows under his eyes were the hollows of a man who had decided a thing slowly in the small hours, and now had to bear the consequences in good light. His linen was clean. His coat was the dark grey he wore at home in the country. His collar was wet. There was nothing in the mirror that would have given Isabel any indication of what he had done. That was, on the whole, what he wanted. The bell rope under his fingers was a silk pull braided in green and gold. The tassel at the bottom had been worn smooth by his mother's hand, then by his own, then by the hand of every footman who had answered every summons in the morning room for 40 years. He let it go, without ringing. Isabel Harcourt's carriage was the post-chaise from the King's Head at Devizes, drawn by 2 rough bays, with one trunk strapped behind, and her father's curate of a pupil on the box because her father could not spare a coachman for the visit and would not have his daughter travel without a man on the seat. She arrived at 20 minutes to 6, half an hour late, soaked through at the shoulders, and very calm. She did not have her shawl held up to her hair for vanity. She had it bunched against her shoulder because the rain had caught the chaise 5 miles from the gates, and her cloak was wet through. She was 26, tall for a curate's daughter, and what one noticed first about her was not the colour of her eyes, they were grey, nor the height of her cheekbones, but the way she did not hurry. Even soaked, she did not hurry. She had been moving at her own pace for so long that hurrying was no longer one of her habits. Theo met her himself in the front court. He had not waited for Carter, the under-butler, to do it for him. He came out bareheaded into the rain. "You will catch a chill," she said, as he handed her down. "Do go in." The rain came down harder against the slate steps. "You first." He kept her hand a moment longer than the formality required. Her glove was wet through. The leather had darkened to the colour of bruised plums, and he could feel the bone of her wrist beneath it, as he could not have through dry kid. "I had thought to send the carriage. You would not let me." "You would have spent £4 8 on it. I was not having you spend £4 8 on a thing I could do for 19. "There is no point of grandeur in 19 shillings. "There is a point of 19 shillings. She smiled at him. It was a small, tired smile, the smile of a woman who had been on the road since dawn, and it was nevertheless the first thing in his day that had not cost him to bear. "Come into the house, Isabel." She set her gloved hand inside his elbow. "I am coming, Theodore." He registered, even as he led her up the steps, that she had used his Christian name without flinching. She had used it for 2 months now, since the 3rd evening in her father's parsonage, when she had decided it was foolish to call a man Your Grace, who had sat at her kitchen table eating bread and beef and refusing a second pot of tea. And she had used it every time since, with a steadiness that he had come to depend on more than he had told her. She would not be calling him Your Grace any longer in any case. He very nearly said so on the steps. He did not. There was a thing she had to be told, and the front court in the rain was not the place to tell it. He took her into the hall and gave her into Mrs. Pell's hands, with the instruction that her things were to be put in the green bedchamber on the south side, that hot water was to be sent up at once, and that supper was to be put back to 8. "And the gentleman in the morning room?" Mrs. Pell asked, very neutrally. "Mr. Carstairs has gone. He will not be returning." "Very good, sir." Isabel looked at him in the half-second the housekeeper looked away. He had not corrected the form of address. She had heard the omission as he had heard it. She did not speak of it. She gave him one short nod and went upstairs after Mrs. Pell, her wet skirts darker than the dye line at the back, leaving on the polished floorboards a thin trail of damp, that the maid would scour out before the dawn bell rang. A footman knocked once, very softly, and the sound of the latch turning came up the south stair and stopped at the half landing. He waited for her in the morning room, with the bell-pull's silk cord between his fingers, and let himself, for the first time since Brierly had gone, name the thing he had done. He was no longer Duke of Marwyn. He was not yet Mr. Ashbridge. He was, until tomorrow at noon, a man in a corridor between two doors, both of which he could pass through, only one of which he wished to. He had not told her that he loved her. He had not told her in so many words. In 2 months of evenings he had said a great many things, and never that one. The evenings of October, when he had ridden over to the parsonage on a thin grey hunter through air smelling of wood smoke and bracken, and lit, by 5:30, by his own lantern. The evenings of November, when her father had sat by the parsonage fire, with a manuscript on his knee that he was forever about to publish, and never published. The evenings of December, when the road from Marwyn to the parsonage had been bad enough that he had spent 3 nights running in the village inn rather than the manor. The evenings of February, when she had come in from her tenant's visits with chilblains under her gloves, and he had warmed her hands against his coat front, and her father, looking up from his Greek, had said in his mild voice that the world was kind to be cold when men were not. All those evenings. And never that one sentence. He had thought to say it tonight. He had thought to say it after dinner, in the long gallery, where the great west window held the last light of the day, and where his great-grandmother's miniature hung. He had thought he would say it, and offer her, in the next sentence, the title that she would not have asked for. He had been wrong about all of it. He had understood, in the last week, exactly what would happen if he offered her the title and asked her to share it. She would accept him. Not because she wanted the title, because she had agreed, 2 months ago, in her father's kitchen, that she would have him, and Isabel Hartcourt did not retract an agreement once she had given it. The giving of it was the agreement. She would accept him with the title, and she would wear the title with her quiet, straight composure. She would carry it the way she carried all the other things laid on her shoulders since her mother's last illness. She would do it well. She would do it because he had asked her. And the Dowager, and Lady Jersey, and Edmund, and 3,000 of the ton would never, never let her forget that she had walked into Marwyn on his arm without the lineage to deserve the standing. Isabel would not have said a word of it to him, ever, because she did not complain. He would not have heard it, ever, because she did not let her hurts make a noise. The marriage that he wanted so badly that it had been the only thing he had thought about since November would have been a marriage in which she was, by inches, made smaller than she was. He could not bear it. He could not bear that he had not seen it sooner. So he had signed the renunciation at 4:20. He had done it before she came, so that when he asked her, in an hour and a half, she would be answering a different question. Not, will you take this title, and these obligations, and these enemies, and this house, but, will you take this man? If she would, on those terms, knowing, a letter would not have been honourable. He had wanted her to arrive without the warning of a letter, so that she would not have ridden 6 hours with the words of a letter in her hand. He thought she would. He was not at all sure of it. The thought that she might not was the thing he had not let himself hold while Brierly had been in the room. He let himself hold it now, for a moment, in the empty morning room with the hyacinths and the sinking fire and the rain, and it sat in him like a small, cold stone, and he did not move under the weight of it. When her step sounded on the stair, he rose. She had changed her gown. He noticed that before he noticed anything else. She had come down in a deep ruby silk that he did not know, that was perhaps her best, and her hair had been pinned with 2 simple pins and was already drying in the warmth from the hall fire. There was no lace at her throat. There was a thin black ribbon at her wrist, which had been her mother's, and which she wore every day. She did not wear jewellery beyond that. He had said in November that a woman dressed well to please her own eye. She had said, in November, that a woman in a curate's house dressed well not to disgrace her father in the village. They had argued about it for an hour without disagreement. He had not forgotten the argument. "You are warmer," he said. "I'm dry. There is a difference. You look very tired." "I have had a very tedious afternoon." "Mr. Carstairs." She said the name without inflection, as though naming a piece of weather. "In part." "And the other part?" He found that he could not, at her arrival, simply say it. He had rehearsed the speech twice in the last hour, and now, with her in the doorway of the morning room and the rain washing the window behind her, he could not deliver any sentence of it that would not insult her by its calculation. "Come and sit," he said. "There is tea. There is also, in the interests of full disclosure, brandy in the cellaret, which I should be glad of in your place." "Tea will do." She sat in the chair that Edmund had not sat in, the one nearer the fire, with the worn arms, and she folded her hands in her lap, and she looked at him, with the same level grey attention she had given him across her father's table. And she waited. He poured. His hand was as steady as it had been that afternoon. He took heart from it, a little. He had not realized that he had been afraid his hand would shake, until he saw that it did not. "There is a thing I have done," he said, "which you should know before we talk of anything else." The fire took the new log, and licked along its underside in a thin, clean line of blue. The hyacinths had finally given up their second wave of scent and gone quiet, the way hyacinths do at the hour when the lamps are first lit. Outside, the rain had stopped altogether. A single late thrush could be heard, somewhere very far down the south walk, putting the last small notes of its evening song into the wet dusk. "Yes?" It is not a thing that I think you will be angry about. But it is a thing that, having done it, I should have asked you first." Her hands had been folded in her lap. They moved now, once, very small, to settle the cuff of her left sleeve, where a thread of the silk had pulled. She did not look up. She did not put down her teacup. She held it on its saucer with the same neat country competence with which she had held her father's coffee cup in the parsonage parlour at breakfast at 7:30 for the last 19 years. "Theodore?" "Yes?" "You are setting a great long preface to it. It will sit better in plain words. What have you done?" He set the cup down on the small table between them. He did not let his gaze leave her face. "I have, this afternoon, signed an instrument of renunciation of the dukedom. It is in Brierly's hand. It goes to Garter at noon tomorrow. It can be stopped, if I wish to stop it, by my sending him in my own hand a written countermand before then. If it goes, and I have said it will go unless I send the countermand, Edmund becomes 9th Duke of Marwen by Sunday, and I am, from noon tomorrow, Mr. Ashbridge." The fire moved. Behind her, the long curtain caught a small draught and breathed in and out, once. She did not speak at once. She looked at him. She looked, very briefly, at the cup of tea in his hand, then at the hyacinths, then back at him. The level grey attention did not change. "Why?" she said, quite gently. "Because I was going to ask you to marry me this evening, and I do not wish to ask you to marry a dukedom." "You think I would marry a dukedom?" "I think you would accept a dukedom because I had asked you to, and I think you would carry it the way you carry everything that is put down for you to carry, and I think it would cost you, and I will not have it cost you. That is for me to decide." He felt the room get very small around the two of them. The wax candles in the sconces on the chimney-piece were guttering. They had been lit at 4 o'clock, and it was now nearly 7. And a thin, white wisp of smoke from the nearest one rose, hesitated, and was carried sideways by the small draught from the hearth. The hyacinths had begun to drop their first papery ferrets onto the polished mahogany of the side table. The clock in the hall struck the quarter, and the deep voice of it travelled through 3 rooms and arrived in the morning room as a soft, considered single chime. It is. Isabel held very still. She did not lift her head. She did not, in fact, look at him at all. She looked instead at her own hand on her own knee, at the small, plain garnet ring her mother had given her on the morning of her 16th birthday, in that same parsonage parlour where she had read aloud the Book of Ruth. And you have not asked. He felt the colour rise into the back of his neck and did not look away from her. I have not. You have decided. I have. She looked at the fire. The light caught the edge of the ruby silk and turned the gathered fabric at her shoulder the colour of the wine that had been spilled on her father's good cloth at Michaelmas. He did not know why he noticed it. He did notice it. Theodore, she said after a while, it is very high-handed. The fire put a single soft red glow along the line of her cheek. I know. Very high-handed. I know it. I beg your pardon for it. I could not see another way. You could have asked. And if you had said no? If you had said no to the dukedom and yes to me, would you have said no to the dukedom? Or would you have said yes, because you had given me your word in October, and you do not retract your word, and Lady Jersey's verdict at the door of Almack's would have followed you to Marwen and back to your father's parsonage, and into Marwen Church before our first child was christened? Would you have said no? She looked at him. She did not blink. The grey did not move. I do not know, she said. That, he said, was the difficulty. She set down her cup. She had not tasted it. She set it down on the small table, and she put her hand flat beside it on the polished wood, and she did not, for a long moment, do anything else. You should have asked, she said again. But the second time, it was less an accusation. The fire collapsed inward on itself with a soft sigh of glowing ash, and Theo crossed to the hearth and set another small apple log on top of it without speaking, and pressed it down with the brass poker until the new wood took. The smell of the apple wood rose into the room, a clean, sweet wood smoke smell, with a faint trace of the cider orchard at the back of the parsonage where she had once, in November, walked with him for an hour without speaking and known, at the gate, that she had walked with him on the strength of nothing he had said, but the way he had held the gate open and let her go through first. You may, if you wish to, make me wait. I have given you until tomorrow at noon. She turned the small garnet on her hand a quarter turn and back. That is generous of you. I do not mean to be generous. I mean to be honest. I know you do. I am sorry She stopped. She picked up her cup and put it down again, and frowned at the fire. I am sorry I am not, this moment, answering you the way you have asked me to be answered. I had not asked you anything. You had asked me a great deal, Theodore. You had asked me whether I love a man or a title, and you had asked it by giving me, in one hand, the answer that does you the greatest possible credit. It is a very Theodore Ashbridge thing to have done. She laughed once, a thin, surprised laugh. It startled both of them. Forgive me, she said. The hyacinths had gone over completely now. 3 of the florets had dropped onto the polished mahogany of the side table. Mrs. Pell would, in the morning, set them outside the kitchen door for the small grey kitchen cat to bat about for a quarter of an hour before they were swept up. Isabel did not yet know about the small grey kitchen cat. She did not yet know about a great many of the small lives that went on under the roof of the house in which she had just been asked, by indirection, to spend the rest of hers. There is nothing to forgive. I have been 6 hours in a chaise. I am not at my best. I am not at my best either. A coal in the grate broke and sent up a brief, soft shower of sparks. Theo turned his head, by an old reflex, towards the sound. He had been raised, by an Eton-trained nurse, to mistrust a fire that talked. He had been raised, by his father, to mistrust most kinds of talking entirely. He was discovering, this evening, that he had been mistaught in at least one of these particulars. You appear to be perfectly composed. That is because Mrs. Pell will be along in 3 minutes to ask whether we should like dinner at 7:30 or 8. Will she? She will. Marwen is run on rails. I have been the only thing on the line that is irregular. The tired smile came back, very small. You will, then, be needing a wife who can manage rails. I will be needing a wife who can do as she likes. We have housekeepers for the rails. The fire in the morning room grate spat once, sharply, as a small green knot in the apple log gave up its last sap. The sound of it was the loudest thing in the room for the count of 3 heartbeats. The hyacinths on the side table, pale blue, with their thick, wet stems showing through the cut crystal, had begun to lean towards the lamp, the way hyacinths in March always do when a fire has been kept high for them. Outside the long sash, the rain had thickened. The lawn beyond the gravel sweep was the colour of old pewter, and the great cedar on the south front stood blacker than the sky behind it. Theo did not look at the cedar. He looked at the line of her shoulder where it met the high collar of the ruby gown. He had been looking at that line, off and on, for 2 months. He had never, until this evening, been at liberty to look at it for as long as he wished. Theodore? Yes? She set her cup very gently back onto its saucer. Tomorrow at noon. Yes. I will give you my answer tomorrow at 11:30, in the long gallery, where there is light enough to see your face by. I will not give it tonight at supper. I will not give it now. I will not give it before I have walked round this house, every passage, every room I am allowed, and looked at it as a house, not as a dukedom, and asked myself whether I can live in it as the woman who married you, knowing what you have done. You may have any room you want. He spoke quickly, without thinking, the way a man speaks who has been afraid for hours. I shall ask Mrs. Pell. She will give you everywhere. She will give you the muniment room, and the still room, and the dairy, and the dovecote. She is on your side. She lifted her head and looked at him a long moment, considering. Is she? Has been for 2 months. She told me at Christmas that I was a great fool to be still riding to the parsonage in the snow when I could have brought her down to Marwen to spend the day in the morning room being warm. I quote, you understand. I do not doubt the quotation. The clock in the hall struck the 3/4 very softly. She will be a great deal more disposed to me tomorrow, if your answer is yes. Tomorrow, Isabel said, at 11:30. She rose. She crossed to the long window. She set her palm flat on the cold glass and looked out at the rain. The fire caught the ruby of her gown, and the rain caught the lamp behind her. And for one slow second, Theo saw, with a clarity that did not have words, the woman who would, if she said yes, walk the gravel paths of Marwen for the next 50 years, as if she had been planted there. He saw also the woman who, if she said no, would go back to Wiltshire on the post-chaise and never speak of him to anyone living and not weep, because Isabel did not weep where weeping could be seen. He had given her the choice. He had wanted to give her the choice. He had not understood until this moment what he had asked her to do. She was given supper in the small dining room, with the silver brought out and the fire banked high and the curtains drawn. Mrs. Pell was firm about curtains drawn when it rained. And they ate cold pheasant and a hot pudding and a little of the white wine that Brierly had laid down in 9. And they did not speak of the renunciation. They spoke of her father's manuscript, and of the new vicar at Devizes who had a wife with a great gift for fixing parsonage drains, and of the price of seed wheat in Yorkshire, which Theo was watching, and of the way the rain had taken the lower meadow at Marwen the previous autumn, which Isabel had heard about and was sorry for. They spoke as they had always spoken. The renunciation sat in the room with them like a third guest at the table, who did not eat, and could not be sent away. When she rose to go up, he rose with her. She gave him her hand at the foot of the stair, briefly, in farewell. He held it briefly. He did not kiss it. He had not kissed her hand once in 2 months. He would not begin tonight, when she had not yet given him her answer. A coal shifted in the grate. 11:30, she said. in the long gallery. Good night, Theodore. Good night, Isabel. She went up. He stood at the foot of the stair until her step had gone past the landing and into the corridor that led to the green bedchamber. Then he turned and crossed back to the morning room and put another log on the fire that no one would sit by for the rest of the night, because he found that he could not bear to leave the small, warm room empty just yet. He sat in her chair. He had not before. It had been his mother's, and after his mother's death it had been Mrs. Pell's, and after Mrs. Pell had taken to the housekeeper's parlour for tea, it had been no one's. And tonight, it had been Isabel's. And he sat in it now, with his hands on the worn arms where her hands had been, and looked at the hyacinths, and thought of nothing at all that he could afterwards describe. The rain fell. The fire settled. Somewhere in the back of the house, Mrs. Pell was issuing instructions about morning fires. Somewhere upstairs Isabel was, perhaps, walking the green bedchamber from window to window, learning the smell and the draught of it. Somewhere, in a townhouse in Mount Street, Edmund Carstairs was writing a letter to his solicitor, or, more probably, drinking a brandy and laughing, about the most romantical fool in the county of Wiltshire. Tomorrow, at 11:30, in the long gallery. Theo closed his eyes and listened to the rain. She did not sleep. She tried. She lay in the green bedchamber under a counterpane that had been embroidered by a Marwen duchess in 1742, and she watched the firelight in the corner of the wainscot, and she did not sleep. A clock somewhere down the passage struck the half-hour. She counted the strokes. Why, she asked the dark, had he done it before she came? Why had he not, even once, in any of those evenings at the parsonage, said the word? Why had he chosen, of all possible afternoons, the afternoon of her arrival? The questions arrived one after another, like cards laid down on a table by an unseen hand, and she did not answer any of them. She let them lie. A coal shifted in the grate and dropped with a small, distinct crack. She flinched, and was startled at herself for flinching. She got up at last, well before dawn, in her wrapper and a shawl that Mrs. Pell had quietly left across the foot of the bed, and she walked the upper passage of the house with a chamber candle. There was no one stirring. The clock on the great stair had been mended in February, and now kept good time. It struck 4 as she passed it. She had told him she would walk the house. She had thought she meant after breakfast, after coffee, after a proper light. She found that she could not wait. She wanted to know it now, in the dark and the silence, before any servant could ask whether she wished a fire built up in this room or that. She wanted to see Marwen, without anyone trying to show it to her. She went first to the long gallery, because that was where she would, in 7.5 hours, give him her answer. It ran the full length of the south front. The chamber candle did not light a third of it. She walked the length slowly, holding the candle higher than her shoulder, and looked at the portraits as she went. Theo's father, in regimentals, in 1798. Theo's grandfather, in a wig, in 1772. Theo's great-grandmother, in a sapphire blue gown with pearls at her throat, in the year of the old pretender's death. Pale, severe, beautiful in the way that Marwen women were said to have been beautiful for 3 generations. There were no Carstairs on the wall. There was, between 2 windows at the far end, a small space where a portrait had once hung, and now did not. The wallpaper there was a shade darker. She stood in front of it for a moment with the candle, and could not decide whether the missing portrait had been taken down recently or long ago. She found, on a side table beneath the empty patch, a miniature in a black ebony frame the size of a man's palm. She picked it up. It was a watercolor on ivory of a young man of perhaps 25, fair-haired, narrow-faced, with very kind eyes and a small, uncertain smile. She turned it over. On the back, in a slanted hand she did not know, was written, H, 1817, aged 23. She put the miniature carefully back where she had found it. She walked the rest of the house. She walked the morning room where she had sat. She walked the library and stood under the long shelf of estate accounts that went back to 1614. She walked the muniment room where Brierly kept the deeds and did not open anything. She walked the still room, which smelt of dried lavender and rosemary and the faint sweetness of last summer's quince. She walked the kitchens and surprised the undercook, who curtsied without a word and went on grinding pepper. She walked the long stone passage to the chapel and stood at the back of it and looked at the small altar by the light of one candle. The Marwen pew was at the front, with its high carved back and its duke's coronets. She did not approach it. She walked back through the house. She walked the dairy, which had a clean, cold smell. Somewhere above her, a board creaked under a maid's foot. The kitchen girls were up earlier than she had imagined, and one of them had whispered something to another by the scullery door as Isabel had crossed the passage. She had not caught the words. She would not, she thought, ever quite know what was said about her in this house, in the back passages at 5 in the morning. That was, she supposed, the condition of the bargain. She walked the dovecote in her boots in the dark, with the rain easing to a thin mist and the doves murmuring above her. The wet stone of the dovecote wall struck cold through her shawl when she leaned against it. A barn owl, somewhere off across the lower meadow, gave one slow, rough cry, and was answered by nothing. She walked the drive as far as the first gate pillar, and laid her gloved hand on the stone, and looked back at the house. It was a great house. It was a beautiful house. It would be hers, if she said yes. But she would not be a duchess in it. She would be Mrs. Ashbridge. The portraits on the long gallery wall would not, in another 20 years, include a likeness of her in pearls. They would include, she rather suspected, a likeness of Cousin Edmund's wife, in some other gown, in some other colour, possibly with greater jewels, and Edmund's wife would be the woman whom the dowager would teach to manage the dinners. That was the thing she had to look at. She made herself look at it. She made herself imagine that long gallery 20 years on, with a portrait of Mrs. Edmund Carstairs, where Theo's great-grandmother now hung. She made herself imagine attending one of those dinners as a guest. The precedence of her seat at the table would be determined by her husband's having no title, by her own being a curate's daughter, by Lady Jersey's penciled list of who should and should not be invited. She made herself imagine the words at the table. Kind words, mostly, because the country was kind to a duke who had married well, and the gaps in the words, where the kindness ran out. She made herself imagine watching Theo bear it, watching him bear, year on year, the price of the thing he had given up, watching him grow quieter and quieter at his own dinner table, because every guest who came to it was, by being there, a small reminder of what he no longer was. Could she ask him to live like that? Could she, having loved him as plainly as she did, sit beside him for 50 years and watch him be smaller, by inches, than he had been? She stood at the gate pillar in the mist, with her gloved hand cold against the stone, and considered this. She considered also the second picture, which was the picture in which she said yes to him, with the title still in his hand. Theo and Isabel, Duke and Duchess of Marwen. The portrait on the wall. The seat at the table determined by his rank and her marriage to him. Lady Jersey, who would, on the 2nd Tuesday of May, have to be at home to her. The dowager, who would be civil because she had been Lady Jersey's friend for 30 years and knew how civility was constructed. The whispering at supper in the Marylebone houses. The carriage at Almack's. The way, when a duchess curtsied to her, the duchess would do it just a fraction less deeply than she would have done it for the Dowager Duchess of Marwen, and Isabel would feel the fractional difference, and Theo, watching her, would feel her feel it. She considered, finally, though Theo had not asked her to consider this. He had been too high-handed to consider that she might consider it. The third picture. Which was the picture in which she said no. In the third picture, she went home tomorrow afternoon on the post-chaise from Marwen Town to Devizes, and from Devizes back to her father's parsonage, and she lit her own fire in the kitchen, and she made her father his tea, and she sat at the table where she had sat for 26 years, and answered her father's gentle questions about the visit, and she did not weep, and she did not write to Theo, and Theo did not write to her, and Edmund Carstairs became 9th Duke of Marwen, and put the Carstairs arms above the gate pillar she now leaned on, and Theo went off into the world as Mr. Ashbridge, and after a year or two, he married someone else, a sensible Wiltshire widow, with a small estate of her own, and a brisk way with children. And Isabel taught the village school until she was an old woman, and remembered him. She considered the 3 pictures equally. She made herself. Then, because she was Isabel Harcourt, and she had been making decisions in her own father's parsonage since her mother's last illness, she walked back up the drive in the lifting mist. The eastern sky was the palest possible grey above the gates by the time she reached the front steps. The house was just beginning to stir. A bell rang once in the back of the building. A cock crowed somewhere down by the kennels. She thought, with a small private smile, that Mrs. Pell would in 5 minutes be deeply, deeply annoyed to find her boots in the front hall caked with March mud. She let herself in by the small side door that the housekeeper had shown her last night. She went up the back stairs to the green bedchamber, dripping. She washed her face. She lay down for half an hour without sleeping. When the maid came at 8 with hot water, she was sitting up against the bolster with her hands folded on the counterpane, perfectly composed, and her decision made. She would not, however, tell him until 11:30. She had given him her word that she would not, and she was Isabel Harcourt. The morning between breakfast and the long gallery was as quiet as any morning Theo could remember at Marwen. The rain had stopped before dawn. The garden steamed faintly in the new sun. Mrs. Pell brought him his breakfast at 9 and did not say what she was thinking, and did not need to. Isabel breakfasted in her room. He did not see her until 11, when she came down dressed in the same ruby silk of the evening before, pressed and dried, with a small lace fichu added at the throat, and asked, very levelly, whether he was at leisure. He had not, of course, been at leisure all morning. He had been pretending to read accounts in the library and not reading them. He shut the ledger. Always. She did not take his arm. She walked beside him to the gallery. The gallery was as full of morning light as he could have wished. He had told Carter to draw every curtain along the south front at 11:15. Carter had done it. The sunlight fell on the polished oak boards and laid the long line of the gallery out as if it had been freshly cut for the occasion. They walked the length of it slowly. She did not speak. She paused in front of his great-grandmother's portrait. She turned, finally, when they reached the small, empty patch of wall where the absent painting had been. Her finger rested an inch from the gilt cipher cut into the empty patch of wall. Who, she said, was H? He had not expected her to find it. He had not, until this moment, thought of it for a year. My elder brother, he said. Henry. He was lost in the year 17 to a fever he caught at Eton. The portrait was painted 3 months before. My father had it taken down a year later because he could not bear, after a certain point, to walk through the gallery and pass it. He took it to Marwen Vicarage instead. The vicar's wife was a cousin. It hangs in their parlour now. The miniature on the table is the one my father carried in his coat. Was it Henry's title you came into? It would have been. He was the heir. And you were not raised to it. The gallery smelled in the morning of beeswax and yesterday's wood smoke, and the very faint cold iron smell that old houses keep in their north walls until well into May. The floor, broad oak boards, laid down in the year of the Armada and worn into a soft channel down the middle of the room by 3 centuries of feet, gave back the morning sun in long stripes. A single moth from last summer hung in one of the cobweb corners of the north window, and did not move. Far away on the south lawn, a thrush was working at a snail against the stone of the lower terrace, and the small, bright sound of the shell breaking carried up the gallery like a struck note on a glass. I was raised to be a country squire of £40 a year, as Edmund put it last night. I came home from Cambridge in 17, to find my brother 3 months gone, my mother in deep mourning, my father unable to lift his head, and the dukedom mine in 8 years' time. You have carried it ever since? I have. Since you were 20? Yes. She stood for a moment longer, with her hand near the empty patch of wall, and then she turned away from it, and walked 3 slow steps along the gallery, and stopped, and turned again, and faced him. You may have my answer now, Theodore. He inclined his head. He did not speak. He did not, this once, attempt to fill the silence with a thing. She drew a slow breath, and held it before she spoke. You have, between yesterday afternoon and last night, done me a great courtesy, and a great violence. I know. The courtesy was that you wished, more than you wished the dukedom, that I should be free. The violence was that you took the choice out of my hands by making it before I came into the house. Yes. The courtesy is the larger of the two, but the violence is the one I shall remember longer, because no one has ever yet refused to let me carry a hard thing. She held his eye. She had not, he saw, slept at all. There was a faint hollow under each grey eye. She paced 3 quiet steps along the polished oak and stopped. I have walked your house. I've looked at it as a house, as I said I would. I've considered 3 answers very carefully. 3. The first was no, to all of it. The second was yes, to you, with the title and the duchesshood, and the dowager, and Lady Jersey, and the seat at her ball. The third was yes, to you, without the title. Mrs. Ashbridge, of nowhere in particular. And I have chosen. His hand closed on the edge of the gallery window frame behind him. He did not know that it had moved. Tell me. You will send Brierly the countermand this morning before noon. You will keep the dukedom. I will marry you as Duchess of Marwen on the terms you would have offered me last night, before you did your great courtesy and your great violence, and we shall agree, between us and from this minute, that you do not, ever again, make a decision of this size in my name without telling me. If that is acceptable to you, Theodore, and you must say so plainly if it is not, that is my answer. He did not move. He could not, for a moment, breathe enough to speak. Why, he said at last, the title? Because it is yours. Because your brother had it for 9 years before he was lost, and your father carried his miniature in his coat to his own grave, with the title in trust for you, and you have carried it for 15 years on top of the loss. And a man who is willing to lay it down because he loves a woman is precisely the man who should be carrying it. Because Lady Jersey is not the reason for the title. Marwen is. The tenants are. The standing wheat in the lower meadow is. Edmund will not pull a single rope of it as well as you will. You gave a short, low sound that was almost, but not quite, a laugh. I will, he said, be the most disliked duke in 3 counties at the next opening of the Lords. A long bar of sunlight crossed the gallery at that moment. The morning had broken proper at last, and fell across the polished oak between them, full of motes. The motes turned slowly in the still air. Some of them caught the gold in his cufflink, and some of them caught the small garnet on her hand, and most of them simply continued to turn, with the patient indifference of dust that has been turning in this gallery since the year the boards were laid down. From below, very faint, came the sound of Brierly being told something brief by a footman, and a chair leg scraping on the library floor. You will be the duke that you are. You have not yet considered Lady Jersey. I have considered Lady Jersey at length, in your stables, between the dovecote and the dairy. I have decided that she is not, in the end, in possession of an instrument of any importance to me. My father's voucher to her balls is not a thing I have ever held or ever wanted to hold. If she chooses to be at home to me, I shall be civil. If she does not, I shall not call. The world will, on the whole, contrive to turn. A bar of sunlight slid forward across the polished oak.
And the Dowager?
The Dowager is your aunt. I shall be very kind to her. She will, on first acquaintance, hate me a great deal. After a year or two, I think she will find that hating me requires more energy than she likes to part with, and we shall come to an arrangement. You have it all very nicely arranged in your head. She had, while she spoke, moved her hand along the cold lead of the gallery casement and back. She did it again now. The lead was old, soft, dimpled by 2 centuries of small hands resting on it during long mornings at the long window. Outside, the south lawn was turning from grey to the green of new April. The shadow of the great cedar lay across it, like a soft black scarf laid on a counterpane. A gardener, young, sleeves rolled, a Hessian apron over his cotton breeches, was raking the gravel of the south walk in long, careful arcs, and humming, very low, the chorus of a song that had been popular at the 3 Crowns in the village last harvest. I had 6 hours of a chaise yesterday, in which to think on the journey down. I have had, in addition, an entire night in your green bedchamber, in which I did not sleep, and an early walk on your gravel before any of your people were up, which Mrs. Pell will be angry with me about by luncheon. I have used the time. He took 2 steps toward her. He did not, even now, reach for her. He stopped a pace from her and waited. Isabel. Yes? I will agree to your condition. Which condition? That I do not, ever again, make a decision in your name without telling you. I will agree. I will not always remember to abide by it. You will have to be a great nuisance to me in the early years about it. I am asking you to be a great nuisance to me about it. That is acceptable to me. Then will you marry me, on the terms you have set out, Isabel Harcourt, and be Duchess of Marwen, on Sunday, 3 weeks? I will. The sun was very strong now along the gallery. He saw, for the first time since she had begun to speak, the smile under the level grey attention. It was the same small, tired smile she had given him in the front court yesterday, but transformed. By what, exactly, he could not have said. Into a smile he had not yet seen on her, and would, he thought, spend the rest of his life trying to bring back at intervals. He crossed the last yard between them. He took her hand. He did, this once, kiss it, lightly on the knuckle, where the wet glove had bruised the skin yesterday, and the bruise was almost gone. You must, she said quietly, looking down at the kissed knuckle. Send Brierly the countermand. It is nearly past. Brierly is in the library. He has been there since 9. He has been waiting for one of 2 things, the renunciation to be confirmed, or the countermand to be sent. He has refused, I am told, to take coffee. I shall now make him take coffee. You shall now make him take coffee. The bell-pulled tassel, the same green and gold silk one his grandfather had pulled in 1791 to announce his own engagement, moved very slightly in the small, warm draught from the south sash. The morning had grown bright enough now to throw the shape of the casement onto the polished oak in 3 neat lozenges. A jackdaw on the chimney called once, and was answered by another from the stables. Far down the south passage, a tray was being carried, china rattling softly against silver, the small, unmistakable music of breakfast being brought up at 10:30. She inclined her head and waited. And then we shall write to your father. The thrush on the south terrace had given up the snail and gone to look for something easier. The sun was on the lower meadow now, in earnest. The grass there showed the first green of a real spring, and the brook beyond the meadow could be heard, very faintly, where it ran over the stones at the foot of the old wooden footbridge. Theo had not, in 7 years, stood in his own gallery on a March morning and noticed the brook. He noticed it now. My father knows already. Does he? I wrote to him at 3 this morning, from the green bedchamber, by candle. The letter is on the table by the window. I had not, at 3 this morning, made my decision. I had written 3 letters, 1 for each picture. I shall now send the one that says yes, with a postscript that the duchessing has been retained against my better counsel. Isabel. Theodore, it is not against your better counsel. It is a little against my better counsel. But you are a good man, and Mrs. Pell will help me with the rails, and I shall, on the whole, manage. The countermand was sent before 11:45. Briley took it from Theo's hand in the library with a face which managed not to register any change of any kind, drank, at the Duke's quiet insistence, half a cup of coffee, and went out by the back drive in the gig he kept at Marwentown. The renunciation in his coat pocket would, at noon precisely, be replaced by the countermand in the Garter's office in Bedford Square, and at 1:30 Briley would be on his way back to Marwen, and at 3 he would deliver to the Duke, in a separate, sealed packet, the original renunciation, to be kept in the locked drawer of the desk under the south window of the study, for the rest of Theo's life. The Duke and Mrs. Pell met in the front hall at 12:30. Mrs. Pell, on being told that her future mistress had walked the entire south front in the dark before dawn, said very neutrally that she would arrange for hot soup at 3 and a fire in the green bedchamber from now until summer, and went away to the kitchens to issue 6 separate orders. Carter, in the hall, did not say anything at all, but the corner of his mouth did, for the first time in Theo's memory, twitch. Isabel ate luncheon in the small dining room, with the curtains undrawn this time, and Theo sat opposite her, and they did not speak much, because there was, between them, the new strange ease of people who had agreed on a thing larger than either of them had quite expected to agree on. After luncheon, she wrote her postscript, and sent it down to the postbag in the hall. Theo wrote 3 letters, one to his aunt at Bath, one to the rector at Marwen, who would call the banns, and one to his man at Lincoln's Inn, and after each letter, he rose and crossed to the long window, and looked out at the gravel, and at the bare beech avenue, and at the small green shoot of the season's first crocus by the boot scrape, and he thought, with a clarity he had not felt in 15 years, that the world was not so very heavy a thing if one was honest with the people one loved within it. Edmund Carstairs' chaise was at the gate pillars at 20 minutes to 3. Theo was in the morning room with the second post when Carter brought him word. He set the letters down. He walked into the front hall. He was buttoning his coat at the door when Carter said, behind him, in a tone that managed not to be a tone at all, "Mr. Carstairs would have come on Sunday, sir. He has come early." "I imagine," Theo said, "he has had a letter." "From Mr. Briley, sir, would be my supposition." "It would be mine also." He went out. He met Edmund halfway down the steps. Edmund had not, this time, brought his own carriage. He had hired one in town, and the horses were not as well matched, and the coachman was, Theo saw without satisfaction, a man Edmund had not employed before. The smile on Edmund's face was the smile of a man who had ridden out of Mount Street with one understanding of his afternoon, and now had another. "My dear Marwen." Edmund had come into the morning room without being announced. He had on a riding coat, the colour of dried mulberry. The cut of it was a year newer than was strictly comfortable for a country call before noon, and his boots had been polished twice that morning, once at the Black Lion at 4 o'clock, and once again at the foot of the South Gravel by the small boy who held gentlemen's horses for a penny. He carried his hat and gloves himself. He had refused, on the doorstep, the offer of Carter to take them. Edmund. The smell that came in with Edmund was the smell of his cologne, a heavy bergamot and vetiver compound he had purchased 2 years ago in Jermyn Street and had never quite finished, and beneath it, the small, honest road smell of wet wool and horse, and the bitter chimney smoke of a town inn. He set his hat down on the side table with the hyacinths. He set his gloves on top of his hat. He did not, this time, sit without being invited. "The countermand, I am told, has gone." The morning room fire had burnt down to a low, steady red. Mrs. Pell would, in a quarter of an hour, send up the 3rd small apple log of the day. The hyacinths on the side table had been replaced. There had been time, between the gallery and Edmund's second arrival, for the gardener to bring in a fresh bunch from the cold frame at the back of the kitchen garden, and the new ones were white, with the tight, wax-green florets only just beginning to open at the top of each stem. Edmund had not yet taken a chair. at 11:15. And the lady has said yes, with one condition, which I am perfectly content to abide by. Ah. Edmund's smile did not move. The eyes did. I am very glad to hear it. Very glad for the family. We shall, in due course, have a fine fat christening to attend, and the dowager will reconcile herself to the bride, and I shall return to being merely the heir presumptive, and the prospect, having had its airing, will recede. Theo did not return the smile. It will. You are very kind to receive me at all. You will stay to dinner. I will not, in fact. I came up only because Briley's note suggested that I might still be of some service. Briley does not suggest such things, Edmund. Briley reports facts. He told you the countermand had gone. That is all he told you. You have come on a different errand. What is it? Edmund's hand went, for 1/2 second, to his coat. It returned to his side as if it had never moved. Theo, who had been watching for it, saw the gesture. He read it as the gesture of a man who had brought, in his inner pocket, a thing he had hoped to find a use for, and now would not. Edmund had risen, smoothing his coat with the heel of one hand. Cousin. Edmund's smile was still in place. May I ask one favor of you, since I've come? Ask? There is a document. It is not, I assure you, a thing you will care to see. It is a memorandum of conversation I had with Lady Jersey at her ball on the 7th. She had said certain things about the Harcourt connection, which I, foolishly, wrote down at the time as evidence, should I ever need it, that the world would not accept the match. I had thought to lay it before you. Now that the lady has agreed, and the title is kept, the memorandum is of no further use. Then it should not be lying about. Give it to me. Cousin, give it to me, Edmund. I shall not read it. I shall put it on the fire in the morning room in your presence. We shall not have a piece of paper containing Lady Jersey's verdict on Isabel sitting in any pocket, yours or mine, for the rest of either of our lives. Give it to me. Edmund hesitated. His face, the face that had been called handsome by every dowager in 3 counties, did, for the first time Theo had ever seen, look uncertain of its own muscle. He drew the memorandum from his coat. It was a folded foolscap sheet, sealed with a smear of red wax that had been hastily pressed. He held it out. Theo took it. Come into the morning room. In the morning room, Mrs. Pell had set, on Theo's instruction, a small fire burning even in the warmth of the new sun. Theo crossed to it without sitting down. He broke the seal with his thumb. The memorandum was in Edmund's hand, 5 lines of it in pencil, with the date in the margin. Theo read the first 3 words and stopped. He folded the sheet without finishing it. He held it in the air above the small fire. Theo had walked to the writing desk and put his hand flat on the closed blotter. A curate's daughter, Theo said, not looking at Edmund, is not a lower thing than a duke's wife. She is sometimes, in fact, a great deal better. Is there anything you wish to say to me before this goes? Cousin, anything you wish me to know? Any other memorandum in any other pocket? Any other sheet of paper that you had thought to keep, for evidence, against the day? Speak now, Edmund. I shall not raise this with you again. There is no other sheet. On your honor? On my honor. Then I am very glad to hear it. Theo laid the folded memorandum on the small fire. The paper caught at once. The wax made a brief blue spurt and went out. The sheet flared, blackened, curled, dropped into the embers, and was gone. He did not, even for the fraction of a second it took the flame to do its work, take his eyes off it. The grate took the paper greedily. The flames were small and fast, and the heat of them lifted briefly the thin curl of the wax seal into the air, where it caught the light of the late morning sun, and dropped, blackened, onto the irons. The smell of burning sealing wax filled the room, a particular hot, resinous smell. the smell of secrets being unmade, the smell of cabinets being closed for the last time. The clock on the chimney-piece ticked exactly 5 times before the last black flake of Edmund's memorandum gave up its shape and fell. "There," he said to Edmund's back, for Edmund had, at some point during the burning, turned to the window. "It is done. I shall not raise the matter with anyone living. Neither will you. You will give the lady, when you meet her, the civility you would have given the daughter of a duke. You will not pretend to a warmth you do not feel. I do not ask warmth of you. I ask civility. May I have your word on it?" A small smile passed across Edmund's mouth. Bitter, brief, not unkind. "You may." "I am very glad. Stay to dinner, Edmund." Edmund did not look up from the carpet. "I had rather not." "As you wish. There is a fresh horse for your coachman, if you want it. The Dowager wrote to me yesterday from Bath. I shall write back today. I shall mention to her that you have called and have been kind. You will appreciate the courtesy in time." "I—" Edmund's hand had gone, this time more openly to his coat. The gesture had no use this time. There was no second paper in it. "Yes." "Goodbye, Edmund." "Goodbye, cousin." He went out. The chaise rolled back down the drive at 3:20. The hired horses were not well matched, and the offside leader stumbled once on the gravel and recovered, and the coachman did not, Theo noticed, draw the rein the way Edmund's own man would have done. The whole thing, the gait of the horses, the slope of the coachman's shoulders, the small, unaccustomed shabbiness of the equipage, felt, suddenly, like the shape of a man who had badly miscalculated the morning. Theo stood at the long window of the morning room and watched the chaise until it had gone through the gates and turned for the Marwen town road and was lost behind the line of beeches. Behind him, in the small fire, the last black flake of the memorandum lifted on a draught, fell back, and broke into nothing. He turned. Isabel was standing in the doorway. She had come in, soundlessly, perhaps a minute before. She had her hand on the doorframe, the way she had had her hand last night, on the cold glass of the window. "He came back," she said. She had come down by the back stair when she heard the second carriage in the gravel. She had seen Edmund's mulberry coat through the half-landing window and had thought, very briefly and very clearly, that it might be the worst hour she would spend in this house. She had decided, by the third step from the bottom of the back stair, that she would not give the hour to him. She had walked to the morning room door instead, and she had paused on the threshold. And she had then walked in without knocking, because the room was, by promise and by intention, hers as much as his. The cedar shadow on the lawn outside had moved a hand's breadth east since they had stood in the gallery. The morning had grown to noon. "He came back. He is gone again. He brought a memorandum he had written down of a thing Lady Jersey said at her ball about your connection. I've put it on the fire. I did not read past 3 words. Theodore. I will not have such things in any pocket of any cousin of mine. I told him so. He has given me his word that there is no second sheet. I am inclined to believe him. He is not a brave man, and he is not, when it comes to it, a malicious one. He is only an idle man who saw a fortune in his way and has now seen it go past him. He came at the family for the title. He came at the family for what the title carries, which is, in his case, an income. He has very little of his own. He is the second son. He has lived, for the last 6 years, on what he could get from the Dowager and on the prospect of me. The prospect of me is now gone. He will, in a month, have looked about himself, and he will, in a year, have married a respectable widow with money. I do not, on the whole, wish him ill. I do not wish him close, either. I am sorry, Isabel said. For what? That the dukedom comes also with a cousin who keeps a memorandum on a curate's daughter. It comes also, he said, with a wife who would have given the curate's daughter no leave to be ashamed of him. I shall, on balance, be content. She did not answer. She crossed the room, slowly, and stood beside him at the long window. Her shoulder did not quite touch his. She did not quite take his hand. The space between her sleeve and his was perhaps half an inch. The rooks were going home over the South Park. The sun was lower than he had expected. He had not noticed how the afternoon had run on. "What time will the rector come tomorrow?" she said. A new fire had been laid in the morning-room hearth. Mrs. Pell had seen to it within 10 minutes of Edmund's departure, and the small, clean applewood flames were just beginning to take hold of the kindling. The smell of the hyacinths had grown stronger as the room warmed. Their cold, green stems were releasing their colour into the cut crystal of the vase, turning the water by slow degrees the very pale green of a glass paperweight. Outside, the rain had stopped. A thin sun was just beginning to find the south parterre. A blackbird put down a low, single, experimental whistle from the cedar. At 10. He is calling the banns on Sunday. A new log settled in the grate with a small, bright shower of sparks. And the Dowager will be furious until July. After that we shall see. Isabel took her cup again. She had, in the half hour since Edmund's carriage had pulled away, taken her tea after all. The cup was the small, thin china one with the bramble pattern that he had, without naming it to her, caused to be brought out from the back of the cabinet, because the bramble had reminded him, once last August, of her father's parsonage hedge. She did not know that he had ordered it brought out. She did know that the cup pleased her. A door closed somewhere far down the south passage. "Mrs. Pell," she said. "Mrs. Pell has already begun ordering the green bedchamber for permanent use. She does not believe in temporary arrangements." "Theodore?" "Yes?" She set her hand on the polished arm of the chair. "It is a very fine house." "It is the only house I have." She did not, this time, look at the fire. She looked at him. "It will, I think, suit me very well." He turned his head and looked at her, and saw, in the angle of her cheek against the late afternoon, what he had seen by the rainlight in the long window of the morning room the evening before. The woman who would, for the next 50 years, walk Marwan's gravel paths as if she had been planted there. The next 3 weeks passed at the pace of a country house preparing for a wedding it had not been told was coming, and had now been told was coming on Sunday 3 weeks. Mrs. Pell took possession of every room not already nailed to the boards. The Dowager, in Bath, replied to Theo's letter with 5.5 pages of close-written outrage, which ended, in the postscript, with a request for the precise date of the ceremony, so that she might be there. Edmund did not write. Lady Jersey did not write either. The vicar's wife at Marwan took to calling at the parsonage in Wiltshire to advise Isabel's father on what the daughter would need by way of plate, linen, and household keys, all of which Isabel could perfectly well work out for herself, but the vicar's wife had not had a wedding to manage in the parish in 11 years, and was not to be deprived. Isabel's father, in Wiltshire, wrote to Theo a letter which was so brief and so warm that Theo carried it in his coat for a week. It read in its entirety, "My dear young man," she has written, "I am very glad of you both. I shall come down for the banns. Yours affectionately, W. Harcourt." Isabel returns to her father for a fortnight to set her own house in order. The post-chaise that had brought her down to Marwan took her back. Theo did not, this time, drive her to the gates. He went in his own gig as far as Devizes, where they parted at the King's Head, with a handshake at the carriage step that was, in length and quality, no different from any other handshake in the courtyard of the inn, and which Mrs. Pell, who had insisted on coming as far as Devizes to see Miss Harcourt safely into the post-chaise, observed with a small private satisfaction, and afterwards did not mention. Theo rode home from Devizes in a slow afternoon, with a sky the colour of weak tea, and a thin, warm wind that smelt of the year's first turned earth. And he thought, on the long 6 miles, about his brother Henry. He had not, for 15 years, allowed himself to think about Henry at length. He had thought of Henry only as the precondition for his own circumstances. Henry's death, the lock that had closed him into the dukedom at 20. He had not thought of Henry as a young man, fair-haired, narrow-faced, with very kind eyes and a small, uncertain smile, in a watercolour on ivory the size of a man's palm. He thought of Henry now, on the road from Devizes. He thought of him for the 6 miles. He thought of him as he turned into the avenue at Marwen, and as he handed the gig to the boy in the yard, and as he went up the wide stair and into the long gallery, and he stopped in front of the small, empty patch of wall and the side table with the miniature, and he looked at Henry's face in his palm, in the light from the long south window. "I have done a thing," he said, very quietly to the miniature, "which I should have done at 22. I've been honest. The house is in good order. The land is well managed. The girl is what you would have liked. She does not flinch, and she does not pretend. The title is still mine. I do not, this afternoon, mind it. I think, perhaps, if you had had the chance to wear it, you would have minded it less than I have. I am sorry, in part, that you did not." He put the miniature back on the side table. He did not, when he went down to his accounts after, feel that he had said anything foolish. The banns were called on the first Sunday in May, in the small grey church at Marwen, with the lower meadow on either side of the churchyard green, and steaming after the morning's mist. The Dowager came down from Bath on the Saturday, and stayed at the vicarage rather than at the hall. Mrs. Pell, who had ordered the Dowager's old room aired and fired for the visit, was hurt by this for 48 hours, and then recovered. The Dowager was a tall woman, in a black bombazine gown of formidable cut, with her own grey hair under a small black bonnet, and her own opinions stored in a great many small black boxes within her. And she sat in the second pew of the church on Sunday morning, with her gloved hands folded, and her face arranged to give nothing away. Thea was in the Marwen pew at the front. Isabel was at her father's side in the pew across the aisle. She wore the deep ruby silk, and the thin black ribbon of her mother's at her wrist, and no other jewellery, and she did not look at Theo until the rector said her name. The rector said her name at the appointed place in the appointed words. "I publish the banns of marriage between Theodore James Ashbridge, 9th Duke of Marwen, of this parish, and Isabel Mary Hartcourt, of the parish of Stowell in this county. If any of you know cause or just impediment why these 2 persons should not be joined together in holy matrimony, ye are to declare it. This is the first time of asking." A child in the pew behind whispered something and was hushed. Somewhere outside a horse stopped on the gravel. The rector waited for the time it took a held breath to be let go. There was, in the small grey church, the small particular silence of a country congregation hearing a duke and a curate's daughter named in the same breath. The silence lasted perhaps 3 seconds. Then the rector cleared his throat, and the congregation rose for the next hymn, and the Dowager, Theo saw with a small private surprise, did not lift her gloved hands from her lap to take up her hymn book. She kept them folded. She closed her eyes once, for perhaps a second longer than a blink. She opened them again. She did not, in the rest of the service, look across the aisle at Isabel. She came up to the hall after the service, with the curate in her own black-painted carriage. She had insisted on giving him the lift. And she sat in the morning room with him for half an hour, drinking a cup of tea and discussing the price of seed wheat in Yorkshire, which Mr. Hartcourt did not know about, and the Dowager did not know about either, but on which they agreed at length to disagree with their respective neighbours. The Dowager did not address Isabel directly during the visit. She did not, however, refuse the chair Isabel offered. She did not, when Isabel rose to pour her second cup, lift her hand to prevent it. She accepted the cup. She returned the cup. She drank, all told, 2 cups of tea and ate 1 small slice of cake. When she rose to go, she took, with a small inclination of her head, the curate's hand and pressed it once. And then she turned to Isabel, for the first time in the visit, and said, in a voice that was perfectly even, "I am told that you walked the south front of this house in the dark before dawn on the day of your engagement. I should be glad if, when I come down for the wedding, you would walk it with me. I have not walked it in 18 years. I should not, at my age, choose to walk it alone. I should be very glad to walk it with you, ma'am. At 6:30 in the morning, before the staff are up. There is a great deal in this house that is best seen before the staff are up. I shall be ready, ma'am. The dowager nodded once. She went out to the carriage. She did not look back. The carriage rolled away down the drive at 2:15, with the late morning sun on the leaders' coats and a small low cloud of dust behind it on the gravel. Theo, in the morning room with Isabel and her father, said nothing. The curate cleared his throat. The sound was a small, dry, country sound, very like the sound of a hymn book being opened on a Sunday morning at 11:05. He set down his cup with the careful precision of a man who has, on a previous occasion, broken a saucer in a duke's morning room and has remembered the fact ever since. The clock on the chimney-piece, French ormolu, 18th century, the small gilt cherub on top of it pointing his small gilt arrow at the small gilt bow, ticked exactly twice. Mr. Ashbridge, the curate said, after a long moment, in the mild voice in which he was about to publish his manuscript every spring of his life. If I may, your aunt has, I believe, just decided to like my daughter. It has cost her something. You will not, I hope, remark upon it to her. I shall not, sir. The curate took a slow sip of his tea. She will, by Whitsuntide, have decided to like her a great deal. She will. The clock ticked twice on the chimney-piece. It is, on the whole, a very fine house. It is. A blackbird sang twice in the shrubbery and went quiet. And the lower meadow is greener than it was last year. Yes. I had thought I should find the prospect of leaving my parsonage harder than I do. I find that I do not, in fact, mind it. Isabel set her hand, briefly, on her father's. She did not speak. She did not need to. The wedding was the third Sunday in May, in the same small grey church, with the hawthorn in full white flower along the churchyard wall, and the late afternoon sun on the chancel arch. Isabel wore, at her own choice, and against the considered advice of the vicar's wife of Marwen, the deep ruby silk for a third time, because she had said she would not have a new gown for the day she belonged to herself the most, and because the silk had been kind to her, and because Theo had not yet, in 2 months, seen her in it without a small, particular look behind his eyes that she liked. She wore her mother's ribbon. She wore one small string of seed pearls that the dowager had sent down from Bath the Friday before, in a flat black box with no note. She wore in her hair 2 simple pins. The dowager attended. She sat in the front pew. She did not weep. She also, Theo saw, did not, at any point in the service, look down at her gloved hands the way she had at the banns. She kept her eyes on the chancel. Edmund Carstairs attended also, because the family expected it. He stood at the back of the church, beside an unknown widow in a respectable bottle-green pelisse, who he had, Theo gathered, lately begun to court in town, and he made his bow to the bride and groom in the church porch afterwards, with a smile that was, for the first time in Theo's memory, not a smile of charm, but a smile of mild relief. Mrs. Pell wept twice, once when Isabel came down the aisle, once when she came back up it, and pretended afterwards to have caught a cold in the long gallery the night before. The wedding breakfast at the hall was a quiet affair. 12 at table. Isabel's father at Theo's right hand, the dowager at Isabel's left, the rector and his wife, the vicar of Marwen and his, Brierly, who had been Theo's father's man and was now Theo's, and who drank, that afternoon, an unprecedented 2 glasses of the white wine of 9. Mrs. Pell, who had drawn herself up to her full height and refused to sit at table, but had accepted, after some persuasion, a glass of the white wine standing by the sideboard. The food was plain. The talk was easy. There were no speeches. Mrs. Pell would not have permitted speeches. After the breakfast, Theo and Isabel walked out alone through the south door of the house and down the gravel walk to the dovecote. The hawthorn over the churchyard wall was just visible above the line of the long beech avenue. The doves murmured. The light was the late slanting light of a May afternoon that had not yet learned to be a summer afternoon. They walked slowly. They did not say much. He had her arm under his arm, not formally, closely. At the dovecote she stopped. She had paused on the south terrace and looked up at the long line of windows above them. "It is a great deal of house," she said.
"It is."
"I shall, on the whole, manage." "You shall."
"Theodore."
"Yes."
"I love you."
He stopped walking. He turned. He looked at her face in the slanting light of the May afternoon. His voice had gone very low. He did not move his hand from her elbow. "I have wanted," he said, "for 2 months to say that. I had thought to say it last Thursday afternoon. I did not, in the end, say it. I shall not lose the chance a second time." "You shall not." "Isabel."
"Yes."
"I love you. I have loved you, I think, from a moment in your father's kitchen in October. I shall not be more precise. I shall not embarrass either of us. But it was, I believe, a Tuesday, and you had been bringing the kettle in. I have not, in the months since, loved you less for one waking minute. I should have said it at Christmas. I should have said it at the dovecote here on a frosty morning in February. I should have said it at the parsonage in March. I shall, from this afternoon, say it as often as you can bear it. That will, I think, be often." He drew her closer. He kissed her. At last, 2 months and 3 weeks late by his own private calendar, on the mouth, lightly at first, then less lightly, with his hand at the back of her hair where the 2 simple pins held, and her hand at his shoulder, and the doves murmuring above them, and the light of the May afternoon dropping a degree warmer on the gravel at their feet. When they drew apart, she said, in a very small, steady voice, "We must go in." "We must." The wind had got up a little. It moved the loose ends of her hair against his neck, and brought the smell of cut grass from the lower meadow. And beneath that, fainter, the smell of the river 1/2 mile away. A cool, green smell. The smell of wet stones and watercress. A blackbird in the laurel by the gate pillars made a long, descending, warning chuckle, and was answered by another from the rose walk. Somewhere, far behind the house, a stable door was bolted home, with the slow, careful slam of a man who has been on his feet since 5. "Mrs. Pell will be looking for us." Mrs. Pell will pretend she has not been looking for us. It is the same thing. Theo did not immediately turn them back towards the south door. He stood on the gravel with her elbow in his hand, and the rain just stopped, and the smell of wet box hedge coming up off the parterre, and he allowed himself, for the count of perhaps a minute, the thing he had not allowed himself in 2 months. He allowed himself to be a man, standing on his own gravel, with his own promised wife on his arm, and no further question to be answered before breakfast. It was a small permission. It was also the largest one he had given himself since he was 19. "Theodore." "Yes." "You will, I expect, never make a decision of this size in my name again." "I shall not. I have given you my word." "You will, I expect, make a great many smaller decisions in my name, for which I shall expect to be told." "You shall be told. By Friday at the latest. By the morning of the day. By breakfast. By breakfast." She laughed, the same small surprised laugh as on Thursday in the morning room, and she put her arm back under his arm, and they walked, slowly, back up the gravel to the south door. It was September, and the lower meadow at Marwen had been cut for the second time, when Isabel walked the south front of the house with the dowager at 6:30 in the morning, as she had agreed to in May. The dowager had come down from Bath the night before, in her black painted carriage, with a small new black silk umbrella and a great many opinions about the harvest. She had taken the room at the hall this time. Mrs. Pell had, on the second night, brought up the morning tea tray herself, and the Dowager had thanked her and not commented on the tray. A letter from her father had arrived in the Morning Post, very brief, sending his love and the news that the parsonage roof had at last been mended. Isabel met her at the foot of the great stair at 28 minutes past 6. The morning was the colour of weak tea. The doves were already at it. Isabel wore a stout pair of country boots, the same boots she had walked the gravel in the morning before her wedding, and a dark indigo shawl that she had taken to wearing in the mornings. The Dowager wore the same black bombazine of the wedding and the same small black bonnet. They walked the south front. They walked slowly, in single file along the gravel, the Dowager in front, because Isabel had quietly let her go in front, and the Dowager pointed out, here, where her own husband had set the urns in 1788, and there, where the great laurel had been struck by lightning in 1804, and at the dovecote, where her son Henry had broken his collarbone in 1803, falling out of the elder tree behind the wall. The Dowager's voice was as level as the gravel underfoot. He was 9. I am told he was a kind boy. He what? Theodore was kinder. Theodore is kinder still. I do not, on the whole, hold with kindness. I have lived long enough to know what it costs the people who carry it. But Theodore was always going to carry it, whether I held with it or not. It pleases me that he has a wife who is kind back. Ma'am, you will, I expect, have a great many children. A wood pigeon called from the high beech at the corner of the south lawn, and was answered, after a careful pause, by another in the chestnut by the dovecote. The gravel under their feet was wet from the night's mist. It took the prints of the Dowager's small black walking boot and Isabel's stouter brown one, and held them, side by side, in the soft top layer of grit. Somewhere in the kitchen wing, a copper pan was being scoured. A soft, round, insistent sound, like a clock running under water. I do not know, ma'am. We have not been married 4 months. The Dowager did not slow her pace. She did, however, draw a small silver vinaigrette from inside the cuff of her glove, and unscrew it without breaking stride, and lift it once to her nose, and screw it shut again. Isabel had seen her perform this same small economy 4 times in the morning already. It was not, Isabel had decided by the third performance, for the smell. It was for the count of 2 seconds, during which the Dowager wished not to speak. You will. Marwen women have a great many children. You will need the green bedchamber for the eldest. You will need the south nursery, the long one on the 3rd floor, for the next 3. The 4th nursery, the small one at the back, was always thought unlucky, and was always given to the youngest, who survived, as a rule, longer than the others. I do not know why. We had a great deal of bad medicine in my day. You will have better. I hope so, ma'am. You walked the south front before dawn on the day of your engagement. I did. At what hour? I rose at 4. I think I was at the dovecote at perhaps 5:30. In the mist? In the mist. With your boots? Isabel felt the small absurdity of the question, and the small dignity of it both at once. The Dowager was not, she understood now, examining her on points of fact. The Dowager was establishing a freemasonry of women who had walked this particular gravel at this particular hour on this particular morning of their lives. And the test was simply whether one had done it or whether one had not. Isabel had done it. She had walked it in stout brown boots, with the laces double knotted, and her hair, beneath the bonnet, still in the loose plait she had slept in. She had walked it at 5:30 in March mist that came up to her elbows. With my boots. The Dowager nodded once. She did not, this time, look at Isabel. She looked, instead, at the long line of beeches at the foot of the south lawn, where the year's first yellow had just begun in the topmost leaves. She turned at the foot of the dovecote and looked back at the south front. I was on this gravel the morning after my own engagement, she said. I walked from this dovecote to the gate pillars at 6:15. I had not, until that morning, set foot in the house. I had agreed to marry my husband at a dinner in London on a Thursday in April. He brought me down on the following Tuesday. I rose at 4. I was at the gate pillars at 6:15. I have not, in 51 years, told anyone that I did it. Mom. There is, in this house, a thing one must do. One must, before any other person can show it to one, see it for oneself. You did it. I did it. I had thought between April and your wedding that I would not be able to forgive Theodore for what he had done, by which I mean the choosing of you, until you had done that thing for yourself. You did it. I am, since the morning of your engagement, content. I had not, until this moment, told you so. I think it had better be told to you. You will not, I hope, mention to Theodore that it was told. I shall not, ma'am. You may, in 5 years, mention it to me again, on this gravel, in the same boots, if you wish to. We shall consider it then. Yes, ma'am. The dowager turned. They walked back to the south door. The morning had warmed, very slightly. A single magpie on the dovecote roof flicked its tail at them and went back to its business. In December, in the December of the second year of the marriage, Isabel came down to breakfast on the morning of the longest night of the year and laid a small piece of paper, folded once, beside Theo's plate. He was reading the Morning Chronicle. He set it down. He picked the paper up. You may, she said, sitting opposite him in the small dining room with the curtains undrawn at last on a sky the colour of weak tea. Open it before you have your coffee. He opened it. It was a single line of her hand. It read, April, you are, by my excellent calculation, to be a father in April. He looked up. She had her hand around her cup. She was perfectly composed. There was, in the corner of her mouth, the small, tired smile that he had first seen by the carriage in the rain in March, transformed by what, exactly, he had still not been able to name. Isabel. Yes. The dining room was full of late morning light. The long table had been laid for two at the south end. The silver coffee pot stood between them with a small white plume of steam rising from its spout in the cold air, because Mrs. Pell believed coffee should be brought from the kitchen at a heat that would warm the hand of the man who lifted the pot. The toast rack held 4 perfect slices and 1 slightly burned crescent at the back, because Mrs. Pell believed that a household without a touch of imperfection was a household at risk of becoming insufferable. The marmalade was the dark Seville from the still room. She poured for both of them. Drink your coffee, Theodore. Mrs. Pell will be in directly with the post. There will be a great deal of household business this morning. The roof in the muniment room has, I am told, a leak. Isabel. Theodore. I love you. By the morning of the day. By breakfast. By breakfast. She lifted her cup. She drank her coffee. He watched her drink her coffee. Outside the long window of the small dining room, the gravel of the south walk shone with the night's frost. The light of the year's shortest day was beginning, just, to lay its thin, grey hand along the line of the bare beech avenue. A single rook crossed the South Park, low against the colour of the sky, and was gone. He set the paper down beside his plate. He did not, for a long moment, do anything else. Then he picked up his coffee, and he drank it, and outside on the gravel of the South Walk, a maid he did not know by name carried a brass coal scuttle from the kitchen door to the morning room, and the small fire he had lit himself in the morning room before breakfast was, by 10 o'clock, the warmest room in the house, and the year had turned. If you have stayed by the fire with us this long, if you have walked the gravel of Marwen with Theodore and Isabel, and waited with them at 11:30 on a May morning, for the choice that was made before it was asked, I am very glad of your company. Tell me, in the comments below, what you would have done in the Long Gallery. Would you have kept the title with him, or set it down, or sent the carriage back to Wiltshire alone? I should very much like to know. Stay with me by the fire. The next story is already laid in the grate, and I shall be lighting it for you very soon.